All right, welcome back everybody to part two. I wanted to follow up on my original video where I did most of the explaining of why I think this setup would work for multi-patient single ventilator. Lots of the detail is there. If you haven't watched that video, I explain most of this. I'm going to kind of touch on a couple of those things. I have a few different topics to cover up here for this video. I'm going to try to make it shorter. I'm going to try not to talk as much. But basically what I'm getting at is if you haven't watched the first video, you might have a lot of questions as you watch this one. So I'd recommend you watch the first one and get familiarized with my proposed multi-patient single ventilator setup, and then watch this one because I've added a couple of things and solved, at least I think, in my mind, I've solved a couple more issues that I think we're all having with this. So, all right, let's see. How much of this have I changed? I don't think I've changed this drawing at all, besides my topics to cover. The thing that's changed is really with the inspiratory assembly. I'm going to get to that here in a second. I just wanted to make sure I have all my topics that we're going to cover. So this is just an updated inspiratory assembly, essentially from my first video. And then we're going to quick recap all the issues, or at least most of the issues that people are having with this. So what do we do about variable PEEPs, variable driving pressures, variable lung mechanics? What do we do about disconnects, healthcare worker safety, aerosol delivery, and then maybe we can even come up with a new way of grouping these patients, because I think so far the best idea that people have come up with is grouping by the required driving pressure, or delta P, but they I think we can get it done in a different way. So here, check it out. I'm going to leave this alone for just a second. Let's take a look at the inspiratory expiratory assembly in detail. So this also has remained largely the same. All I did was add two things. So if we look over here, there's an extra little piece in front of this little one-way valve, and then I also added on maybe end-tidal CO2. I was watching a couple of other videos, reading some of the forum responses and everything, and a lot of people had mentioned different setups utilizing end-tidal CO2. I'm not going to get into everybody else's different proposed setups because I don't want to make this video longer than it needs to be. But I did notice that end-tidal CO2 was a theme, and I forgot to throw it in there originally. So definitely, if it's feasible and your facility has the ability to throw in end-tidal monitors, we would obviously just throw those in here as close as we could to the actual patient connection without interfering with our suction or anything else. I know there's some HMEs that have a little adapter for end-tidal sampling. Just depends what you have, and then just make sure you follow your facility policy for placement of your end-tidal adapter. But end-tidal CO2 would give us even more information about what's going on with these patients, and then it would kind of take the, well, I wouldn't say entirely eliminate the need for volume monitoring or flow monitoring, but it would be another excellent tool to have. Anyway, the big thing that I'm excited about, that I actually am taking a cue from one of the other videos that I watched, where I think there was actually a couple videos where people were using like what appeared to be little ball valves or some sort of adjustable valve in their setup. The way I think that would work best in this setup is to put the adjustable valve before the one-way valve. Now, what does the adjustable valve do? And it doesn't even have to actually be an adjustable valve. It could be like an adjustable ball valve or needle valve or whatever kind of valve you have on hand that's actually adjustable. Or it could just simply be a clamp point, like if you have those big, thick rubber adapters. That the only thing I could think of that I ever actually used them on was the like some expiratory part of an old 7200, but those big, thick, rubbery adapters, if you adapted in one of those big rubbery adapters right here and just had it be a clamp point, the whole idea is that we can use this to adjust the actual pressure that the patient is getting versus relying on the pressure that's coming from the ventilator. So I'm not going to explain all of these different steps. I did that in the other video. None of this other stuff has changed. Like I said, the only thing I added was if you have the capability of end-tidal monitoring, that would just be extra information that we're armed with so we can make better decisions. And the big game-changing part is adding the adjustable valve. So again, I didn't think of this all on my own. I was watching a bunch of other people's videos and posts. Some of them featured some sort of adjustable valve, so I'm just, again, taking a cue from that and adding it into my proposed setup. I think that needs to go right here. Whether it's an adjustable valve or it's just a clamp point that you clamp with hemostats. I don't think it would be a good idea to clamp the actual corrugated tube itself, because it seems like that would sort of lose its integrity and wear out kind of quickly. But I guess if you had to clamp the corrugated tube itself, you would. But I would just try to find something else to use as a clamp point. So let's see what that actually does for us. Let's translate this setup right here to the grand setup. So where did I put it? Here we go. Okay, I wanted to have it in Paint actually. Okay, so taking that updated inspiratory setup, or inspiratory assembly, so we crossed that off our list. That's what we're using right here. Expiratory assembly stayed the same and everything. Of course, all same lengths at different generations of tubing, everything I mentioned in the previous video. So what is the big deal about having that little ball valve or having the clamp point or some sort of adjustable valve in the inspiratory assembly here? What that's going to do is allow us to have control over what pressures actually get delivered to the patient's airway. So we already said we're measuring, just to recap, we're measuring the patient's airway pressure right here. As close to the patient as we can on the inspiratory side, preferably right at the Y adapter, using a little O2 bleed-in adapter with a manometer so we know what pressure is reaching the patient. Well, up until this point, without the addition of some sort of control valve or clamping, the patient was just getting whatever pressure the machine was set at. So my theory is that this will only work in pressure control. So that's nice. It'll give every patient the same pressure, but that's also a drawback because it'll give every patient the same pressure, and these patients realistically might need different pressures. So we have the ability to monitor the pressure of each patient with a fair amount of accuracy at the airway. And then what that allows us to do, so I'll just make up some numbers here real quick. Let's just say we set them at, so here's my example. It's just PCV. Our patients would be, they would need to be paralyzed for this to work, heavily sedated, paralyzed, so there's no inspiratory efforts and they're not hogging air from any of the other patients or triggering the machine or anything like that. So it would essentially be control mode, whether you run that as control mode or AC. But I'm not going to get into that. It's pressure control ventilation, and let's use just a big inspiratory pressure. Let's say an inspiratory pressure of 50 centimeters of water pressure. So not all of our patients are going to need 50. We wouldn't want all our patients to get 50, but before we were stuck with all of our patients getting the same pressures, which was one of the huge drawbacks that I saw people complaining about. Well, here's what happens. We can do plus, let me make that a little thicker. Let's do plus 50. So it would be plus 50 in here, which means plus 50 in here. And this is on breath delivery. So whatever rate you want. To discuss breath timings and ventilation scheme and the potential tidal volumes that the vent can deliver in the previous video. We would have plus 50 in all of these. Sorry, I didn't want to fill this in before because I thought it would have just made this look way too jumbled and turned a lot of people off. So I'm drawing on it as I go so you guys understand what I'm adding. So the ventilator kicks, it's delivering the patient their whatever it is, 1.5 or 2 second long, 50 centimeter of water pressure breath. Well, we don't want all the patients to get 50. How do we stop them all from getting 50? We have this wonderful clamp point or adjustable valve right here, whatever form that takes, whatever you have available to you. So we can cut that 50 that's coming from the ventilator, 50 in this way, cut it down to whatever we want the patient to get, still take advantage of the wonderful one-way valve filter, aerosol if we have to, and here we go, this wonderful little O2 bleed-in adapter that's connected to a manometer. We could adjust our valve or adjust our clamp point here to the desired pressure that we actually want the patient to get. And then when they exhale, so we already took care of humidification, we got closed suction, maybe some end-tidal in there. They exhale through another bacterial viral filter. We have some sort of method of measuring expiratory flow or volume, even if it was just, only a couple breaths and you had to move that to the next patient, just something so that we could get an eye on what the expiratory flows or preferably the volumes are. And then this all-important adjustable expiratory or adjustable external exhalation valve, meaning that it's an external valve. Patients can all exhale independently. They don't have to exhale through the same expiratory limb and everything else, but we can also independently adjust PEEP. So sorry, that was probably a little bit wordy, but just making sure we had this whole thing down. So we go back to this. The ventilator is filling all of our tubes up here with plus 50 centimeters of water pressure, but we have a diligent clinician here who's monitoring all these patients very, very closely and is adjusting those adjustable valves or adjusting the clamps, whatever it is, so that we're getting as close as possible to the prescribed actual inspiratory pressures. So let's say this patient, we adjust the valve and they're getting an actual inspiratory pressure of 30. This one over here only needs an inspiratory pressure of 25. This one's doing better, so they only need 18. And then this one needs exactly, 26 for some reason. So we would want to have more pressure than we need up here in the delivery tubing. Once it got up to the patient, there would be more than we need here, so we're just simply setting up a pressure gradient. We've got essentially 50 centimeters of water pressure to sip from. We open up the valve just enough to let 30 in, or 25, or 18, whatever it is that your particular patient needs. So let's recap all the issues that this now potentially addresses. Again, I haven't actually done this. I haven't had the opportunity to test it. I'm hoping that I can or somebody can at some point. If you are able to test this, whether or not it works or whatever it is, I just want to know, because I just want to know. It's fascinating. This has suddenly become a very fascinating subject for me. So quick recap of the issues that this particular setup would address if coupled with, again, this inspiratory-expiratory assembly. What would we do about variable PEEPs? This setup would be utilizing external exhalation valves with adjustable PEEP. So there's our variable PEEP addressed. What would we do about patients needing various inspiratory pressures and essentially delta P's? Well, we just said we can meter the amount of pressure that each one of these patients gets by using a clamp point or by using some sort of ball valve, needle valve, whatever it is that we have on hand. So by us being able to adjust the PEEP independently for each patient, so I'll just emphasize, let's say this person's on plus 10. I know these numbers will probably look ridiculous if we actually add them up. I'm just making examples. This person's on plus 12. This person's on plus 8. This person's on plus 20 of PEEP. So we have the ability to set the PEEPs independently. We have the ability to set the inspiratory pressures independently, which means we can give our patients whatever delta P we want. We can adjust the ventilator to their blood gases. We can increase their oxygenation or their ventilation independently using those parameters. So that would solve some of the problems with our patients who have varying lung mechanics, such as airway resistance and static compliance, which we know they all do. So all those issues right there potentially addressed. You could have patients with different compliances and resistances on this setup because, like I said, it would be pressure control and we wouldn't be forcing volumes into these patients. We would just be pressurizing their airways, essentially pressurizing their lungs to a preset pressure and getting as much volume in there over the longest possible inspiratory time that we possibly could. What about disconnects and safety? We said in the previous video, clamping the inspiratory limb if you had to disconnect for any reason, if you were changing out piece of equipment in the circuit, changing on a filter, if the patient coded, if you had to bag them for whatever reason, you wouldn't have to shut this whole setup down. All you would have to do is clamp right here. So if your setup didn't have a clamp point that we were just talking about, you actually had an adjustable valve, or if it has the clamp point, then just clamp that point all the way down. That will stop breath delivery from this point forward. No breaths will reach right here, so we can do whatever we want with this patient. We're not going to be we're not going to be spraying juice all over the place. And all of these patients will remain unaffected because they're not active in their inspiratory efforts. They're heavily sedated and paralyzed. It's pressure control. So at the end of the day, the ventilator is going to pressurize this tubing to whatever our target pressure is, in theory. And we're metering that pressure with each breath, and we're changing the PEEP on each patient. So we still have plenty of control. We can disconnect this patient or disconnect potentially 3 patients if we had to. Clamp, 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 and it's still a pressure control ventilator feeding 1 patient. So that's my theory, at least on disconnects. As far as CPR, equipment changes, that sort of thing, we can just clamp the inspiratory limb for each patient that we needed to intervene with, and the other ones would still function. So that checks out. As far as healthcare worker safety and everything, the clamping is going to stop the spray. There will still be a lot of PEEP in there that we would have to watch out for. So you'd have to be aware of that. But there's also plenty of bacterial viral filters between the inspiratory and expiratory assembly, as well as the one-way valve and everything that's stopping these patients from potentially coughing, like coughing air down a circuit and into another patient's lungs. They're exhaling independently, so they're not going to impede each other's exhalations, and they're paralyzed, so they're not going to, one person isn't going to steal air from another person. So I think we have all of those things covered, from disconnect, healthcare worker safety, and then preventing cross-contamination between the patients themselves. Aerosol delivery was addressed in the setup, whether or not you need to deliver aerosols to your patient. In the spirit of keeping all of our runs of tubing and compressible volumes the same, it might be good to just add the ability to deliver aerosol to all these patients just in case you need it. I don't know if that would be necessary, if it would make that big of a difference, but just a suggestion. And now, the last thing I'm going to bring up, I had mentioned, I think in the description of my last video, or maybe I talked about it, is that the best scheme that I had seen people come up with when using a setup, whether or not it's similar to this, it was just patients sharing ventilators on pressure control. People were saying the best way to group them would be to group them by their required driving pressure. Well, we already said we can change the amount of pressure each patient can get. We can change the inspiratory pressure. We can change the PEEP, so we can therefore manipulate their delta P. So the patients wouldn't have to be grouped by driving pressure. The only things that we're not able to change in this setup, at least big ones that I'm thinking of off the top of my head, we cannot make the FiO2 unique to each patient, which wouldn't be such a big deal in this case because they're all probably going to require relatively high FiO2s anyway. And we would not be able to adjust rates independently for these patients. So that's why I said this would present the possibility of potentially grouping these patients by required rate, because, again, in theory, on paper, my magical paper setup here, this whole setup would allow us to manipulate each patient's inspiratory pressure and PEEP. Everything would be filtered, so we wouldn't have to worry about contamination of patients or healthcare workers, and there's a one-way valve. So when patients cough or whatever it is, they wouldn't be able to cough that way back into the circuit and essentially into other coughing air pressure into other people's lungs. So that's my theoretical thing. I haven't thought too much about when you suction what that would do. We're probably not sucking that much air out, so I don't know if it would be enough to open up this valve. I don't think it would, because there'd be so much PEEP in the circuit anyway, so suction would probably work. I just haven't thought about it too much at length. So I think that covered all of it. Again, I said I wanted to try to keep this video as short as possible. I wanted to try to ramble as little as possible. I'm just trying to get people to look at this from an alternative angle and see that, you know, this isn't as terrible as a lot of people are saying it is. I think a lot of us, and I'll admit my knee-jerk reaction when I first heard this was, oh my God, that's impossible. Why would we ever think about doing that? That's entirely unsafe, because we didn't have control over so many variables the way a lot of us were thinking to set this up. But just looking at this, I mean, please correct me if I'm wrong, or if you see an opportunity to change something or throw something in here, whether it's, you know, this generic setup or the detailed setup. If you think there's something that needs to be added or changed, or we could add an extra feature to this, by all means let me know. But the way I'm looking at this on paper, and just with, you know, a couple simple calculations, this seems like it should work. By no means ideal. I hope we don't ever have to actually do this. I think I stated that in my previous video, but it's just one of those what if situations. Well, what if it gets to that point? Could we potentially do this? It kind of looks like it's plausible. So I don't know. I would love to test this, or I would love for somebody to be able to test this. So hopefully this just adds more to the conversation. Always be safe. Always, if you're ever questioning anything, always, you know, get a second opinion. Find somebody who's got extra experience. Get an extra pair of eyes, ears, and hands in there. Anyway, I think that'll do it for this video. Let me know what you think.